The best world builders I know, at least as writers, are lazy. On purpose. They'll spend a month getting one city exactly right and then wave a hand at an entire continent like it's somebody else's problem. And somehow their world feels deeper than the one you've been building for 3 years. That sounds backwards, I know. We're told a rich world means knowing everything. Every god in the pantheon, every trade route that ever moved a sack of grain. But the settings that feel bottomless didn't come from the people who built the most. They built the least they could get away with. And they knew exactly which parts those were. That's the whole trick. And the gap between doing that and just being lazy for real is smaller and sharper than you'd think. The reason almost nobody does this, the reason you keep opening your World Bible instead of the manuscript, is that overbuilding never feels like a mistake while you're inside it. It feels like the most responsible thing there is. You're not procrastinating, you're being thorough. You're honoring the world instead of faking it. And the work genuinely never ends, which is the trap closing without a sound. Because there's always one more god to name, one more language whose verb system you could probably sort out this weekend. You tell yourself you'll write the chapter the moment you've nailed down the trade routes. But the trade routes need a working currency. And the currency needs to know which kingdom mined the most silver 3 centuries ago. And 4 hours later, you've got a gorgeous spreadsheet of medieval exchange rates and not one new sentence in the actual book. World builders have a name for the place this leads. They call it Worldbuilder's disease, and the cruelest part of it is how productive it feels. Brandon Sanderson, who's built about as much fictional cosmology as any living human, warns his own students about exactly this. That you can spend so long building that the sheer size of what you've made paralyzes you, and you never start the actual story. It's procrastination wearing the costume of diligence. That's what makes it so sticky. Regular procrastination at least feels like slacking. This one feels like devotion. And most of us have the folder to prove it, I know I do. The World Bible that outgrew the novel it was supposed to serve, sitting on top of a draft that stalled at 20,000 words and quietly died there. If you've got a graveyard like that, a string of beautiful abandoned worlds, I want to be really clear about one thing, because it took me years to understand it. You didn't fail because you didn't build enough. You built plenty. You just spent almost all of it on the part of the world your story was never going to walk through. So why does building less make a world feel like more? Think about the last fictional world that swallowed you whole, the one where you finished the book and felt like the place kept existing after you closed it. Like there were cities down roads you never traveled, and wars that had ended generations before chapter 1. That feeling, that the world is somehow bigger than the story, is the entire game. And that feeling is manufactured. Almost none of what made the world feel infinite was on the page. You built the rest yourself, in your own head, out of a handful of clues the author left lying around on purpose. This has a name, and world builders borrowed it from Ernest Hemingway. He pointed out that a story works like an iceberg. The reader only ever sees the tip, the small part above the waterline, while the enormous mass that gives the whole thing weight stays hidden underneath. Sanderson teaches the same shape for worlds. Most of your world should sit below the surface, unseen, and only the few pieces your story needs ever break above the water. The reader senses the mass. They never have to see it. And the proof that this works is the single most overbuilt fantasy world there is. You'd assume Tolkien made Middle-earth feel ancient through sheer volume, the appendices, the thousands of years of invented history. But Tolkien himself said that wasn't where the magic lived. He said the pull of the books came from the glimpses of a larger history in the background. And he compared it to seeing the towers of a distant city far off in a sunlit mist. The point is that you don't go there. The moment you march the reader into that distant city and start explaining it, the mist burns off and the magic dies. Depth, for the man who built more of it than anyone, lived in the things he pointed at and deliberately never reached. You can actually watch him do it. Early in the Fellowship of the Ring, Aragorn quietly sings a few lines about Beren and Luthien, a love story from thousands of years before anyone standing there was born. We never get the whole tale, not really, not in that moment. But those few lines tell you the world has a deep past stuffed with loves and losses the size of legends, and that the people walking through it now are small, and late to it all. One song fragment and the ground under the story suddenly feels 10,000 years deep. The reason this works on us is almost unfair. People are pattern completers by reflex. Give a reader 2 or 3 precise specific details about a place. The way a port city taxes foreign sailors, a public holiday nobody ever fully explains, and their mind quietly assumes the other 10,000 details exist too. All of it just off screen. You got a few things exactly right, so they extend you credit on everything you didn't show. That's the whole mechanism. You're not building a complete world. You're building a convincing surface and letting the reader's imagination do the expensive part, which means the real skill was never building more. It's aiming by knowing which few details to get exactly right and which corner of the world to develop. And you can't aim until you know what your story is really about underneath the plot, what it's reaching for. If that part feels foggy, that's the thing to fix first. And it's exactly what I built my free story compass for. A short field guide with 3 tools, the spark, the story promise, and the logline, that gets you clear on your story's true north before you build a single mountain range. It's free, and the link's in the description. Once that's clear, the real question becomes which parts of the world have earned your effort. So let's get concrete about that. The rule is simpler than it sounds, and once it's in your head, you'll start applying it to everything. You build deeply where the story physically touches the world, and that's a shorter list than it feels like. Start with the places your characters set foot in. If they never go there, you don't need its tax code. Then the systems they lean on, the magic they cast, and the coin they spend, because those touch every single scene. And the one slice of history that reaches forward into the conflict they're living right now. Not the whole timeline, just the part that still shapes the present. That's your 10%. Everything else, the far continents, the dead empire nobody in the story ever visits, gets implied, gestured at, left in the mist. There's a second reason this works, and it comes back to the reader again. Readers treat detail as a signal. When you describe something, really describe it, spend words on it. You're telling the reader something quietly underneath the words. You're implying this matters and that they should pay attention here. So when you lavish 3 pages on a kingdom the plot never returns to, you haven't enriched your world. You've misled your reader. You've aimed a spotlight at a door that never opens, and they'll spend the rest of the book waiting for a payoff that isn't coming. Spend your detail where the story goes, and the spotlight and the story finally point the same direction. Picture it concretely for a second. Your heroes spend the whole middle of the book in a port city, so that city gets the full treatment. You know what the harbor smells like at low tide. You know which guild you have to bribe to get cargo off a ship, and which saint the dock workers pray to before they do it. You know why the upper district quietly resents the lower one. It's specific and lived in, a place your reader could walk through blindfolded by chapter 20. Meanwhile, the empire across the sea, the one everyone's afraid of but nobody visits, gets exactly one unforgettable detail. Say, every envoy it sends arrives a full day early and never explains why. And then you stop. That one detail does more work than 40 pages of imperial history ever could, because the reader takes that single unsettling fact and builds the terrifying empire for you. The city you walked through, you built. The empire you only pointed at, the reader built. And the reader's version is scarier than anything you would have put on the page. Now, if all you took from that is build less, then I've done you a disservice. Because there's a version of this that's just genuine laziness wearing my argument as a disguise, and the gap between the two is the thing to watch out for. Everything I've said so far could be used to justify doing almost no work at all. Skip the hard parts, wave your hand, call it an iceberg, and ship it. Plenty of thin, flimsy worlds have been defended with exactly that logic. So where's the line? What separates a world that's strategically spare from one that's just empty? Hemingway, of all people, drew the clearest line in that regard. His theory of a mission came with a catch that people love to forget. You can leave a thing out, he said, and the reader will feel it there as strongly as if you'd written it, but only if you know it. If you leave it out because you don't know it yourself, you don't get an iceberg. You get a hole, and the reader feels the hole every time. That's the entire difference, right there. Strategic laziness is when you know what's under the water and choose not to show it. Actual laziness is when there's nothing under the water and you're hoping nobody dives down to check. You can see this working at full scale in A Song of Ice and Fire. George R.R. Martin's whole world leans on a catastrophe called the Doom of Valyria, an empire of dragonlords that died in a single cataclysm centuries before the books even open. He almost never shows it. You get ruins no sane captain will sail near, and a handful of melted artifacts that shouldn't still exist. The legends themselves survive only in pieces, half remembered and usually half wrong. And out of those scraps, readers have reconstructed an entire lost civilization in their heads. Vivid enough that people write essays about a place Martin mostly just gestured at. He knew enough to imply it convincingly. The reader did the rest. That's the iceberg working exactly as designed. So the move is to know the few things that genuinely matter and then imply them on the cheap. And this is where world building gets genuinely fun. A crumbling watchtower on a hill, nobody bothers to garrison anymore. And the reader instantly knows there was a war here once, and a border that used to sit somewhere else. When you have a character who spits after she says a certain king's name, you have a betrayal or some old grudge between the characters. fully implied without you ever once having to stop and dramatize. Another way is to use a single offhand line such as, "That's been illegal since the second flood." Suddenly your world has survived at least 2 floods big enough to reset its calendar, and a legal system that still remembers them. None of that requires an entire world-building document. Each one is a single well-placed detail that implies a deep history you were smart enough not to write out in full. But, and this is the part the lazy version of strategic laziness always skips, whatever you do choose to show has to be airtight, specific and consistent every time, because the reader is trusting the entire unseen world based on the handful of details you committed to. Get those right and they'll believe in a continent you never described. Get them sloppy or contradictory and the whole illusion collapses. Now they stop trusting the parts they can't see because you've just proved you don't have them. A hollow iceberg floats perfectly fine. A cracked one sinks, and it takes the story's credibility down with it. Now everything so far has been about knowing what to build. But once you know what to build, the next question is how to build it well. Because the 10% you do keep, you want to make genuinely deep, the kind of place a reader sinks into and doesn't want to leave. That's the whole job of my world building system. It's a 10-module walkthrough that takes you from a blank map to a deep, story-ready world Bible, the full method for taking the parts that matter and building them into something rich and alive. It's on Founder pre-order right now ahead of its August launch, and you can find out more via the link in the description below. With that said, let's go back to that paradox from the very start. The one about lazy world builders whose settings somehow feel deeper than yours. It isn't a paradox anymore, is it? Of course their worlds feel deeper. They spent everything they had on the parts you experience. And then they let your imagination, which is far more generous and far more frightening than any prose, build the rest. You see, concentrated effort reads as depth. Effort smeared thin across everything reads as a wiki nobody asked for. The reader feels that difference even when they couldn't tell you what it is. And the bigger payoff isn't even on the page. It's that the story actually gets finished. The whole reason this matters, the reason I'm not just handing you a neat trick, is that the overbuilt world is where books go to die. The moment you stop trying to build everything, the project stops being infinite. It becomes a thing with edges, a thing you can complete. And a finished, slightly spare world that a reader fell in love with beats a magnificent, exhaustive world Bible bolted onto a novel that doesn't exist. And it does so every single time. Now, to be clear, you should absolutely still plan. The trick is to plan where it counts. Martin has this line about writers being either architects, who blueprint the whole house before they build, or gardeners, who plant a seed and find out what grows. Strategic laziness is just knowing which parts of your world to architect. The load-bearing ones, the points of contact, and which parts to let grow wild and mostly off the page. You're not refusing to build. You're refusing to build the parts that don't matter, because any depth you waste time and effort on never reaches the reader anyway. So if you've been carrying around a low-grade guilt that your world isn't detailed enough, that the real world builders must have a binder for every province while you've got 3 good cities and a lot of fog, you can put that down. That restraint is the skill. The fog is doing real work for you. The only thing that separates you from the people you're comparing yourself to is whether you know what's out there in that fog or whether you're just hoping. So build your 10% like it's everything. Imply the rest like you mean it. And then finally, go write the story it was all for. And when you do, it's almost impossible not to include some of the fantasy genre's most prominent tropes. So watch this video here next to see how they work before misusing them kills the iceberg you're building.